Shabbat Shalom. When I was young and reckless, as opposed to being old and reckless, I often would end up with splinters. One of the problems that comes from playing outside a great deal in a rather uncivilized part of San Diego. And, of course, when you got a sliver, if it was a big one, no problem, you just pulled it out, it was good. But if it was one of those little slivers, the kind that get right under the skin and then, of course, snap off, how do you get the splinter out? A needle, exactly. And my grandmother was the go-to person to wield the needle to remove the splinter. But, of course, there was always a necessary step before the needle was brought to the skin to begin digging. And that, of course, was sterilize, which meant passing it through the flame of the stove. Right? The gas burner would be on, and she would pass the needle back and forth, and then get down to work. Why? What was the fire meant to do? To purify it. Purify it from? From the joins, right? From the germs. We are good, modern 21st century people, and we know that there are germs on many objects, in fact, pretty much everywhere, and if you are going to introduce that object into your body, you need to purify it with fire. You need to burn the germs to death in order to be able to get digging. It was always that tense moment of just watching the needle go back and forth, knowing in a minute it's really going to hurt. And that anticipation is something that perhaps we might mistakenly attribute to what we saw in the Torah reading this morning. Because if you were not extremely careful or more likely versed in how the Judaism handles these topics, you might have conflated two things that were happening seemingly simultaneously but for entirely different purposes. And if you did so, you would come to some erroneous conclusions, not just regarding the topic at hand, but perhaps other aspects as well. I am speaking, of course, of how do we handle the loot? How did we handle the treasure that was brought out of this war with Midian? If you want to talk about the human treasure aspects, that is a much longer and much more complicated conversation, which I'm willing to begin at my table during the Kiddush luncheon. I'm talking here about the material treasure, about the pots and pans and various utensils that the Torah describes having been taken during this conflict. And they are prepared, I'll try to use as neutral a term as possible, for their use within the camp of Israel through two different methods, if you were paying attention. One of which was, of course, as we've been mentioning, fire, and the other is water. The other is water. But the thing is, each of those components are entirely different. These are not two parts of a single ceremony. They are each meant to change the status of these items in two fundamentally different ways. So let's start with the fire aspect. What is the fire meant to do for these pots and pans and plates and utensils that are being brought back from the war? Kasher them. They are meant to make them kosher. Now, you might be thinking, okay, kosher, so we are purifying them, because kosher is really about the non-kosher germs, right? Sorry, thank you for playing. That's not what's happening here. This is, in fact, a very early example of material science. When we heat up an object that has been used for non-kosher purposes, cooking whatever the meat was of the Midianite people, we need to render it kosher by making it expel any remnants of that meat. Well, if you have an object and it was used on a fire, it was on your cooking fire in your village, when it was cooking, what happens to the molecules, the material of the metal walls? Well, the metal probably doesn't vaporize and ignite too much, but it expands. It expands. We all know this. If you have a tight jar lid, you run it under hot water to get it to expand, and then you can pop it off and you're going to be much happier. And this was something that was understood, even if they lacked the chemical formulae to explain it, by our ancestors. That when you're cooking, your pots, when they're hot, have gotten opened. All their pores are opened up in this process. And then when it cools down, what happens? It shrinks and it traps any of those bits of the actual food that was being cooked in the pot. This is, in fact, how cast iron works and why cast iron pans have to be seasoned in very particular ways, because they are trying to trap those molecules of previous greases and oils in order to create the non-stick coating, and from what I've been told, I'm no expert on this, improving the flavor of everything you cook into it, on it in perpetuity. But that I don't offer a guarantee on. I only know about the material science. So the material science is that, yes, things will become trapped in the not open to our, not available, not visible to the naked eye, porous surfaces of these ancient pots. Now, obviously the ancient pots looked even more porous than modern ones. Cast iron would have been a luxury for people back then. Their copper pots were not mere polished, so it would have been a little bit more obvious to them. But the truth of it is there, that when we heat up through fire an object, it opens itself up again, and that anything that it had absorbed, yeah, can be expelled, and now the pot is truly empty, and thus can be used for kosher purposes. The fire is only there to mechanically, to physically cause an actual reaction within the material that will allow it to expel what it had absorbed when it was previously hot at some other time. Good? Good. By the way, if you want help knowing how to kosher your kitchen in the modern world, let me know. I'd be happy to show you how. So where does the water come in? The water isn't there for kashrut, although clearly you did have to wash away any obvious bits of food still congealed within a pot. The water is there because these utensils came to us through the process of war. And in the process of war, the single most defining feature of war is people die. And Judaism treats the death of a person extremely seriously. In fact, it treats it so seriously that it is considered to be a peaked moment of the disruption of our flow in the connection between us and God. And so we become ritually impure. Now, this is not the same as actually absorbing kosher or non-kosher food bits. This is an entirely spiritual status. To be ritually impure is not to be dirty, it's not covered in germs, it's not got non-kosher bits. To be ritually impure is simply to be spiritually disruptive from our connection with God. And the items around us become equally impure. And therefore, if we want to use them, they have to be purified. Now, why aren't they being purified by the fire? After all, my grandmother's needle was purified by the fire. Why can't we burn off the impurities of death with fire? Again, as modern 21st century people, we would think that's a wonderful idea because we understand about the germs, and in particular germs that can be concomitant with death, that heat will indeed purify things in those places. This is why there are formal sterilization practices in medical procedures, precisely so that anything that might be a problem will be removed through that fire. But not so in Judaism, because again, the ritual impurity that comes through contact with death is not a physical impurity. This is not about particles. This is not about germs. This is not the same as what we were doing with the pot and the fire. Instead, it is removed through water. It is removed through a special form of water that has been properly mixed with the ashes of a red heifer, something that we read about just a few weeks ago or earlier on in the book of Bamidbar. But this process has nothing destructive to it, to the person that is receiving it or the item that is receiving it. There is no fire. There is no suffering, there is no pain. It is simply a ritual to go through, to acknowledge that having come face to face with death, we and the items that were present at that moment must undergo a ritual practice to properly reboot, to reset that flow between us and God. For death is the ultimate opposite of what God wishes for this world. This world is meant to be a place of life and goodness. However necessary, especially in war, death might be, we do not casually brush it to one side, but must acknowledge that it happened, must acknowledge the disruption, and must, through ritual, acknowledge the necessity of a procedure for reestablishing our proper connection to that flow of God, which is focused upon life. Now, am I making much about little, a mountain out of a molehill? A little fire, a little water, I mean, come on, is this such a big deal? Well, it is because the symbolism of what takes place during these two separate acts is often confused or conflated. For many people, when they are faced with a problem that has left them feeling contaminated, that has made them feel impure, whether it was something they did or something someone else did to them, they often struggle with trying to rebalance themselves. And too often, especially in this modern world, people will reach through the medium of foreign ideas and not through Torah for fire as a means of self-purification. And by fire, I don't necessarily mean they're putting their hand into an oven, but they look for something that will cause pain, something that will cause destruction, something that will give them a feeling that they have properly suffered for whatever this problem was, and through the suffering, they will be cleansed. No, we use fire for the pot because it had literal pieces of non-kosher food still inside of it. We didn't use fire as a punishment for the pot. We didn't use fire as a way of degrading it in order that we could reclaim it in some way. It was a very practical, mechanical act. The thing that actually had ritual impurity, the spiritual part that can cling to us and make us feel disrupted in our connection with God, that didn't need pain. That didn't need suffering. That simply needed time, reflection, and a moment to feel washed clean of whatever it was that was still adhering to us spiritually, that was blocking that relationship with God. But too often in the modern world, we venerate the suffering, we venerate pain. And too often people who are going through difficult circumstances will turn to that, either exposing themselves to the harm of an abusive relationship, thinking that somehow they deserve this, somehow they owe it to the world to suffer, to martyr themselves, or, in the most extreme and sad cases, towards various degrees of self-harm, thinking that somehow they can make themselves right if they hurt enough. This is not what Judaism teaches. Yes, we acknowledge there can be these disruptions in our connection with God, but those just need care, time, and water. They need a transition point to allow us to feel that emanation, that flow of God, the ever-flowing spring of life. It does not require that we suffer or that we weep. It does not require that we break or expose ourselves to harm. This little episode here teaches us so much, and yet day after day, so many of us will turn to our own fantasies or to various social media trends and fads, looking for solutions to our problems. And too often, especially in this modern world, we venerate that which hurts, when all we need is that which heals. The Torah says that water is all we need. And our tradition says that whenever the Torah mentions water, what it is truly looking for is Torah itself. It is through embracing the goodness of Torah, found in the community, found in our own study, found in our own practice and observance of the commandments, that we will find healing, that we will find health and we will find goodness. No pain is necessary. No pain is wanted. God wants none to suffer. Embrace the gift that God has given and find your way back into that flow. Shabbat Shalom.